Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So as you'll recall, we have been discussing the fact that we have seen the testing of Jesus. We had Jesus come in during the triumphal entry. He cleaned out the temple. We find out about the results of him cursing the fig tree. And then we have several moments where the Pharisees asked Jesus questions. We saw where his authority comes from. Should you pay taxes? The really dumb marriage question. And then, of course, this one about loving the Lord your God. So now, at the very end of that, it says, after that, no one dared ask him any more questions. So they hit a point where they realized that they weren't going to be able to trap him with a question. So they stopped asking. And so now it comes in, and as Jesus taught in the temple. So we find out he's in the temple. So now they've stopped asking questions. So now he's teaching. Okay. And he says, and as Jesus taught in the temple, he said, how can the scribes say that the Christ is the son of David? Okay. So we've heard that phrasing, Jesus is the son of David. Okay.
Which is from the lineage of David.
He's from the lineage of David. Okay. And that's what that means.
Okay.
But what Jesus is getting at is David himself in the Holy Spirit declared, the Lord said to my Lord. Okay. Now we'll break this first one down. Okay. So the Lord is speaking, the passage in Psalms that brings this up, when it says the Lord said, okay, the one doing the speaking is God. It is Yahweh. That's what is used there. Okay. Said to my Lord, and this is the Greek word here is the Hebrew word that would have been here is Adonai, which is my Lord, my King, okay. So notice, David is the one speaking. Okay, so as David is speaking, God said to my king, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet.
And at that point, he was talking to David.
So David is the one speaking here. This is a quote from Psalms. Let me look for sure. This is a quote from Psalms 110.
Okay.
Okay. So God says to my king, this is David speaking, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet.
Okay.
So David himself calls him Lord, calls him king. So how is he his son? So how can, and this is the idea, how can the Messiah be the son of David or be less than David when David himself calls him his king?
Because David is knows that he is the son of God.
Right. Okay. So, and that is correct. Now, the funny thing is, this is not the last time this becomes a big deal. Okay. So we come back to, and this is not exactly the same passage, but it is, wanted to make sure. Okay. So in Acts chapter 2, okay, we see the coming of the Holy Spirit. Right?
Yeah. With the tongues of fire over the head.
And as the tongues of fire come, as they're all speaking in tongues, all of that, Peter, and this is verse 14, but Peter, standing with the 11, lifted up his voice and addressed them, men of Judea and all who dwell in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and give ear to my words, for these people are not drunk, as you suppose, since it is only the third hour of the day. It's 9 o'clock in the morning. Okay. This is Acts chapter 2, verse 14, starting in verse 14. Okay. Now, since it's only the third hour day, but this is what was uttered by the prophet Joel. And then he quotes Joel. We won't read into this. So verse 22, so we fast forward to verse 22, and it says, men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God, with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. This Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, was crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. God raised him up, loosing the pangs of death, because it is not possible for him to be held by it. For David says concerning him. And so now we come into another quote from David.
Okay.
Now this time it is Psalm 16. But it says, I saw the Lord always before me. Okay. For he is at my right hand, that I may not be shaken. Okay. Therefore my heart was glad, and my tongue rejoiced. My flesh also will dwell in hope. For you will not abandon my soul to Hades, or let your Holy One see corruption. You have made known to me the paths of life. You will make me full of gladness with your presence. Now, David is speaking here, but he is speaking on behalf of the Messiah. And that's what that.
I'm sorry, what are you reading?
Okay, so 14, verse 25, the end of 25, all the way to 28 on Acts chapter 2. Okay, so Psalm 16 goes into this, and what Peter is bringing up, and we'll see this in just a minute, it is clear that while David is speaking as this person, he is not actually this person. Okay. And the reason why Peter's going to get into in just a minute, but notice how it says it. He's at my right hand. Well, the Lord is with me always. And that's kind of the idea. My heart is glad. I will dwell in hope. For you will not abandon my soul to the grave. Okay. You'll not leave me in the grave. You will not let your Holy One, your anointed one, see corruption. Okay. And then in verse 29, Peter goes, brothers, I may say to you with confidence about the patriarch David, that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. Being therefore a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that he would set one of his sons on the throne, he foresaw and spoke about the resurrection of the Christ, that he was not abandoned to the grave, nor did his flesh see corruption. This Jesus God raised up, and of that we are all witnesses. Okay, so notice once again, we are making a connection between the words of David and Jesus.
Yes.
Now, Jesus is the son of David as far as by lineage. But he's the king over David. He's the Holy One.
Yeah.
He is something far more than that. And David, both in Psalm 16, which is quoted here in Acts 2, and the passage in Psalm 110 that is quoted in Mark, bring us this picture of Jesus, and then, of course, Peter here in Acts, bringing up the fact that as David talks about these things, he is talking about Jesus. So the idea that Jesus is bringing up himself is, you call him the descendant of David, but really he's David's Lord. David is not greater than him. Okay. So now we move on.
And that is fulfilling a prophecy that God gave David.
Yes.
By Jesus.
Yes.
His Lord.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
That's what's up.
Okay. David is, and by the way, this is an interesting element to this. Okay. And Matthew specifically deals with this at great length. Jesus in the book of Matthew is portrayed in a couple of ways. Okay. Jesus is the new Moses, and he is the new David. Okay. David is the king, and he is the king of the Jews. He is the new David. He is the king like David. But he is also the prophet like Moses, or really the priest and prophet like Moses. However, when you look at, and this is an interesting element of this, there are some elements within the story of David specifically that show that David had some elements in his life with God of being both prophet, priest, and king. Okay, now let me explain what I mean. He is a prophet in that he spoke the words of God, and we see that in the Psalms. We saw that just now in Acts chapter 2. Okay, the priest discussion, really the main place it comes from is number one, David wrote most of the praise music for the temple. A vast majority of it. But even more so than that is remember that there is a moment where God allows David to take and eat the bread that is reserved only for the priests.
I remember that when he's running.
Uh-huh. And then he's king.
And then he's king.
Now, none of those roles are the same as what we discuss with Jesus, because Jesus is completely our prophet, our priest, and our king. Okay, now let me explain. What have we said that a prophet does?
Talks for God.
He speaks for God. Jesus is the full revelation of God. He is the full revealing of who God is. He is the ultimate prophet because he really is the physical representation of who God is. And we know that because remember in John 14, it says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father.
Yeah.
Okay. He is also the perfect priest. Hebrews goes into great detail about that. And speaking of the fact that in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, there is this guy that we suddenly see out of the middle of nowhere. He gets less than a chapter of time, named Melchizedek.
Oh, yeah.
And it says that Melchizedek was a priest of the living God.
Yeah.
And Abraham comes and meets Melchizedek. By the way, Melchizedek is the king of Salem. He's the king of peace. Okay. Now, some scholars believe it's a guy named Melchizedek because later we find in Jerusalem another group of guys that their surname is Zadok. So maybe he is just a guy. Okay. He is, however, a representation of Jesus. Okay. He is the King of Peace, which is who Jesus is. Other scholars believe maybe he really is an appearance of Jesus before the incarnation. I don't necessarily think that's the case. But Hebrews uses that character who gets less than a chapter in the Old Testament to build this beautiful picture of why Jesus is a better priest. Because Abraham gives the tithe and receives a blessing from Melchizedek. Okay? Which means that 100 and something years, well, 400, 500 years before Aaron is even born, his however many great grandfather was blessed by this priest, which means that this priest's ministry, in a way of thinking, he blessed Aaron because he blessed his great granddad. Okay, the entire Levitical group of priests, when Melchizedek blesses Abraham, and when he receives a tithe from Abraham, Levi isn't even a thought yet. And so the writer of Hebrews says, look, it means that his priesthood is superior because the very man who's the progenitor of the Levitic priesthood worshipped with him.
Yeah, gave tithe and all that with him.
And then he goes on to say that Jesus is like Melchizedek. He is part of a priesthood that has no beginning and has no end and isn't bound to the law of Moses. That's the other element of this. He is a priest of God apart from the law. The Levitical priesthood is bound in the law of Moses. because all the rights, privileges, responsibilities, all of that of the Levitical priesthood is bound up in the Mosaic law. The priesthood of Melchizedek is apart from the Levitical law. And so, under Christ, who is not bound by the law of Moses, because the law of Moses has now been fulfilled through his death, burial, and resurrection, he now stands as a high priest before God and makes atonement for us. And he is the first and only priest in all of history who does not have to make a sacrifice for his own sin before he sacrifices for ours. Remember, when we talk about particularly the Day of Atonement, and this is where this is going, during the Day of Atonement, the Levitical priest had to go in and he would do a set of sacrifices for himself.
Yep.
To cleanse his own sin.
Before even attempting to do the.
And then once he had cleansed his own sin or covered his own sin with the blood of a bull, then he comes back out and gets the bull for the nation and kills it and does the same thing again. Jesus, unlike Aaron and Eleazar and all the priests of the Levitical tribe, Jesus didn't have any sin to gain forgiveness for. So when he goes to the cross, he has no sin of his own. And so he becomes, as he is our high priest, he becomes not only the high priest, but he becomes the very sacrifice. And his sacrifice is once for all because it was absolutely complete. He was a man without sin. He's a perfect representative of God as prophet, but he's a perfect representative of us as priests, because what does a priest do? They are a mediator between God and man.
And that's what Jesus does.
That's what he mediated between through his own death. But he's not just the perfect prophet and the perfect priest. He is also the perfect king. He is the one who will come and rule and reign forever. So that is a major element when we get into all of this discussion. When we look at the life of David in the Old Testament, we see this little bit of prophet and priest scribbled in with his kingship. Well, Jesus is better. He's the perfect representation of all three of those. He's David's king. He's David's priest. He's David's prophet. He is like David, but he's a better David. He's like Moses, but he's a better Moses. Because he has no faults of his own. David himself calls him Lord. Okay. So when we move on at verse 38, it says, and the great throng heard him gladly. Okay, and then verse 38, it says, and in his teaching he said, beware of the scribes. Now,
Mine says, beware of these teachers of religious law.
okay, yeah.
Is that
So that's what it is. A scribe would be a person who read and taught the law.
Okay.
Okay. Verse 38.
In Mark.
In Mark chapter 12. Okay, sorry, we're back in Mark. So beware of the religious leaders, beware of the scribes. Okay. Now why? Well, because they like to walk around in long robes and like greetings in the marketplace. Okay. So here is the idea, and this is very strong. It is a shortened version of something we see in one of the, and maybe this is the first one. We really don't know. But we know that in Matthew and Luke, there are some longer treatises on this, beware of the Pharisees and beware of the scribes. Okay. But here it's this idea. Okay. Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like greetings in the marketplace. So first of all, they like to be seen and they like to be greeted. And the greeting would have been, hello, Rabbi. Hello, Rabbi. Hello, Rabbi.
Yeah, mine.
Oh, I'm important. See? And to have the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts. By the way, this is very much a telling thing because it also tells us something about some of the other stories in the Bible. We see Jesus invited to a feast at the house of one of the Pharisees. What's really going on there? Well, Jesus was the guest of honor because he was the hot rabbi on the scene.
Gotcha.
So they invited him to say, I got Jesus at my party. And so
Before they decided they wanted to kill him.
then a woman comes and starts to wash his feet with her hair and her tears. And they're all, oh my gosh, I can't believe he's letting her touch him. Letting him, he's letting her touch him. And he goes, well, hold on. You didn't wash my feet when I came in. You didn't give me water you didn't do any of the things a good host would do for me. And yet and so in a way, it's you invited me out of pretense and she's giving me an authentic show of honor. But the idea here is that the priests have figured out that if they're a priest, then they get all the perks of being important. In a way, it's a lot like sometimes we see among politicians. They really like the fact that they are big men on campus.
I like that.
Okay. So, and then it goes, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. So they hurt those who are in need because they don't show mercy. They don't show grace to a widow who is in a bad shape. And they pretense make long prayers. So they pray for a long time, but they don't really mean anything.
It's just empty words.
Just empty words. And it says they will receive the greater condemnation. Look, when you know better and you teach others to act like you, apart from God, there is a greater condemnation. Now, I've got to be fair. I think that there is a connection between the two of these because he's just made this comment about devouring widows' houses. And then suddenly it says, and he sat down opposite the treasury and watched people putting money in the offering box. Now, I think it's funny that mine uses offering box. From tradition, we know that what it was a big bronze jar. Okay.
Yeah, mine doesn't say box.
So here's the idea. All the currency's in coins. So think about a metal jar and coins.
And it jingles.
Okay. The thing I think about from our own culture is those things they always had in the mall where, you put the quarter on the outside and knocked it in and
I love those things. They were so cool.
Okay. That's not what it is, but that's always what it makes me think.
Yeah.
So they're putting money in the offering box and it says many wealthy people are coming in and they're taking big old handfuls of coins and cling, 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 cling. And then a widow comes in and she takes two tiny little copper coins, something like a penny. Maybe even, and used to be a case that there was a half a penny, right, that two coins made a penny. And that's what we're talking about, is something like that. And you hear
You used to have the coins in your office.
tink, tink.
Yeah, tiny little things.
Okay. And suddenly he pulls his disciples over and go, hey, I want to tell you the truth here. Truly, I say to you. Remember, when he says, truly, I say to you, it's important. Okay. If he adds a second, truly, it's really important and nobody's going to get it. But truly, I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box. So what is he saying? Well, this woman loves God more than all the rest. She has contributed more. She has given more. Why? Because they contributed out of their abundance. Okay. So another story, we talked about it a little bit this morning in our Sunday school class. There's a story in the Bible that says that this guy, it's a parable of Jesus, and he says this guy had a bumper crop. He had the crop of a lifetime. And he looks out at his crop and he goes, wow, there's so much crop. My barns aren't even big enough to hold all my crop.
At which point he should have given the.
And then he goes, I know what I'll do. I'll tear down my old barns and build bigger barns so that I'll have room to hold all my stuff. And then I'll be set for life. And I can just eat, drink, and be merry in my wealth.
Until it's infested with bugs.
Well, but then what
stuff.
God does is Jesus says, but God laughs and goes, but you're going to die tonight. And all that stuff that you put in these bigger barns is all going to go to somebody else. By the way, Solomon says the same thing. He goes, collecting wealth is stupid because you just give it to your kids. That's how he phrases it. He goes, if you toil your entire life to gain massive wealth, guess what? When you die, your kids who really don't appreciate it. That is exactly how he says it in Ecclesiastes.
Yeah.
So they are giving out of their abundance. They got more than they could ever use, and they're giving a little bit of their extra. She is giving every single penny she has. This is a woman that she has 2 little copper coins to her name. That was how she was going to buy food. But as she came into the temple, she decided to give it to God.
But somewhere where they don't tell us, God blesses her.
Well,
and after that, I'm
but
sure.
here's the thing. We can say that, but we don't know that.
Yeah, you're right. We don't. Sure.
That God blessed her and provided for her, and that we can assume that because we know God is faithful.
Yeah.
But it doesn't tell us. He certainly was not aware that was what was going to happen.
Probably not. No.
But remember, and this comes back to another Old Testament story. Remember the story of Elijah and the Shunammite widow. Okay. So remember, it has not rained at this point for 2.5 to 3 years.
Okay.
No crops are growing. All the cattle have died. I mean, it is bad.
It's bad.
So, we think about what happens when we have a drought for 7 months with no rain. We're talking not 3 years with an average lower than normal, or 3 years with, a couple of small rains. We're talking 3 years with not 1/100th of an inch of rain. And Elijah comes to this widow and her son. And he says, you wouldn't happen to have anything to eat, would you? And she goes, well, I've got enough flour and enough oil to make 1 cake of bread. Me and my son are going to share it, and then we're going to starve to death. And Elijah goes, and clearly he had a reputation as a prophet because she did this. But he goes, look, make me a cake of bread. And if you'll do that, if you'll make me the cake of bread, then I promise you, until it rains again, that jar of oil will never run dry, and the bowl of flour will never be empty. And for another 6 months, she lived off of 1 meal's worth of flour and oil. 1 meal at a time. That's where this lady is. She's at the end of herself. She's ready to give up. A widow's life in the Old and New Testament was a horrible. Because what it tells us that he calls her a widow and says that she's poor, says that her children have refused to take care of her, or maybe she doesn't have any children. There is no one to provide for her.
It's like I read a thing about how we got piss poor as a terminology, because back in the older days, you were piss poor when you had to sell your pee to tan leather. But if you didn't have a pot to piss in, you were extremely poor because you didn't even have a pot to sell your pee in back in the older days.
So yeah, they used to tan leather with urine.
With urine. Oh yeah. It's so cool. Interesting little history stuff.
The uric acid in it
yeah
helps tan leather. But Anyway, the idea here is, and this is very important. A widow at this point in time would have been it would have been a miserable life to be a widow without children to take care of you. Okay, that is the actually that's the discussion of Naomi and Ruth.
Yeah, that's why
Naomi is in the worst place possible. She has no sons. She has no husband. She's in a foreign land. And she decides, I'll go back home and then maybe I can scrape together a living, but she's an old woman and maybe I'll be able to beg enough to eat. Okay. And she tells her daughter-in-laws, go back home because I don't want you to have to live this life because now you're widows too and you have no kids to take care of you. And Ruth refuses to go.
I love that story.
Okay. And when you get to the end of the book of Ruth, the big blessing that is spoken of Ruth is that she was as good for Naomi as 7 sons. If Naomi had had 7 sons, she would have been fine.
Yeah.
She would have had enough to eat. She would have been in good shape. But Ruth, chose to go into widowhood with her and to provide for her like she was one of her sons because of her love for Naomi and her love for God. And what we see God bless both of them. But the big thing at the end of Ruth, as much as we talk about Boaz and we talk about the lineage of David following on, is that Ruth is called to be better than her having 7 sons.
Yeah.
Because she would not abandon her mother-in-law.
This is awesome.
Would not abandon. This woman is not in the same place. She has at some level, we don't know all the story, but the way it's worded makes it seem like she has been abandoned by everyone. And she's begging for what little money she can get to eat. And maybe this day she was able to get enough for food and have 2 copper cents left over. And okay, I'll go give them to God. Or maybe she didn't even have enough food for the day. We don't know. But we see that all of this discussion comes down to look at her commitment and look at everybody else's. It's kind of like the old joke that says a chicken contributes to breakfast and a pig commits to breakfast.
Ain't that the truth?
Okay, a chicken contributes to breakfast. It lays an egg and you use it to have eggs. A pig commits to breakfast. He has to die so you can have bacon. See, the rest of these people are contributing to the church or contributing to God and the temple. She is committed to God and the temple. She's giving everything she has. My wife is the queen of one-liners, so that's where
I love it.
Did you need that again? Okay, a chicken contributes to breakfast and a pig commits to breakfast.
Yep. No greater commitment.
Now I want to second.
A pig commits to breakfast
There's no greater
in that he
commitment.
gives his life for our bacon.
Yeah.
It's so
Bacon.
cool.
Bacon wrapped jalapenos. That sounds so good.
Okay, so now chapter 13. I don't know how far into this we'll get, but we'll at least get started here. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said, "Look, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." So they walk out of the temple and the disciples are just amazed at how beautiful the temple looks. Okay. Jesus says to them, or said to him, to the disciple who said this, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Okay. Now, remember, we talked a little bit about how this works. We are in a way, Jesus is reiterating the same thing that we saw in the story of the fig tree. Okay. Remember, he comes up to the fig tree. Okay. And it's March or April, somewhere right around there. It's a little early for figs, but he goes up to the fig tree to see if maybe there are some early figs, and there aren't. The tree looks alive, but it has no fruitfulness. Okay. And he curses the fig tree and says, "You'll never bear figs again." Okay. They go back the next day, and the tree has not only lost all of its leaves, but it's dead to the roots. Like, you've seen a tree that's been dead a while.
Yeah.
Okay. It looks like it's been dead for years, is kind of the idea I get. Okay. And then he talks about prayer. But part of that picture is that as they go in between those two stories, they go in and see the temple. And they go into Jerusalem and they see what's going on at the temple. And he throws out the money changers and all of that. The temple is pictured in this fig tree. It's lively. There's lots of people there. But there's no real worship. There's no real fruitfulness. There's no real commitment. And so now he says, do you see these buildings? They're going to be torn down to the point that there won't be one stone left on another. In fact, we know from history that after the Romans came in and destroyed the temple and destroyed the city of Jerusalem, there was a deep valley on the eastern side of Jerusalem that is no longer there because it is filled in with the walls and the temple and all the stones of Jerusalem. They sacked it.
Yeah.
Okay. So then they move a little further. This is verse 3. They move a little further. Now he sits on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. And Peter and James and John and Andrew, so 4 of them, the two sets of brothers, ask him privately, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? Now, what are they asking him about?
They're asking for a sign of when this is going to happen.
When what's going to happen?
When the demolishing of
the temple is going to happen. Okay. Now, he is also answering about his return here, and I want to make sure we understand that.
I read ahead.
Okay, but it says, okay, see that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, I am he. They will lead many astray. Okay, so first sign for the coming of the end. Okay. There will be false prophets. There will be false Christs. There will be false messiahs. And by the way, when you look at Hebrew history, that was certainly true before 70 AD. Okay. It's also going to be true before the end of all things. Okay. They'll lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. So when you hear about wars everywhere, okay, when you hear about the rumors of wars, okay, now, so let's take a moment and move forward. The funny part of that is that has been true for the remainder of human history from the time of Jesus' death.
Yeah.
However, there's some fun details that go into this. Okay. So World War I started in 1912. 1912. I think that's right. I don't remember all the dates. But the reason World War I started, or one of the major things that led to the beginning of World War I, was an assassination. One country assassinated the leader of another country. Okay, but most historians will tell you that one of the reasons that happened is there had been a period of about 40 to 50 years in Europe where there'd been no major war. Okay.
Was it World War One, the Nazi war?
No, that's World War II.
Okay.
Okay.
So it started
because of an assassination.
Oh.
But one of the things that led to it is that there was a generation who had not really known the horrors of war. Okay. It's a movie line, so it's not really accurate, but it is kind of an interesting movie line in one of Mel Gibson's movies called The Patriot. He's talking about the American Revolution, and he says, "Look, this won't be a war that's fought across the sea or fought in a frontier somewhere. It'll be fought among us, and it will be something completely different than what you've ever encountered before." As far as the American colonies. And that was true. But this is once again, war had kind of gotten out of their system. And so they didn't realize how horrid war could be. And so you have this massive war from, I think, 1912 to 1917. Okay. An American president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, said that it was going to be the war to end all wars. Okay, this world war will stop war forever. Okay. And by the way, from 1917 till 1939, that's pretty much true. There was still military development, but all the major powers that had been involved in World War I made treaties to limit their military production, and there were no major wars or skirmishes or anything anywhere in the world. And there really was a theological idea that we were moving to some kind of utopia. Okay, and this was a Christian idea. And then in 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. And we start the Second World War. So here is the thing that is interesting. Since the beginning of the Second World War, there has not really been any quantifiable period where there has not been some kind of major military conflict in the world.
Yeah.
Because after World War II, you had Korea, you had Vietnam, you had the entire Cold War.
Yeah.
Okay. Then you have Somalia, you have Iraq, you have, Afghanistan, and every time you turn around, there's another war. Now there's Ukraine and Russia and Israel and, Jordan and all of that that's going on right now. Or Israel and Palestine, which isn't even a nation, but we'll not go into that. But notice this idea. It says, "Don't be alarmed. This must take place. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There'll be earthquakes, there'll be famines. These are but the beginnings of birth pains." So understand what Jesus is saying. These things that you're seeing, this massive rise in war, this massive rise in hatred between countries, geologic disasters and famine and all of those things, they are like the first contractions of a pregnancy. Right? You now know labor has started.
Yep.
Maybe a while, but labor has started. Be on your guard.
Up for that epidural.
So it says, be on your guard. Well, why? Because you will no longer be welcomed, is kind of the idea. They will deliver you over to councils. You will be beaten in synagogues. You will stand before governors and kings for my sake to bear witness before them. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. Okay, so then the gospel will reach all peoples. And when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, okay, so not if, notice, not if, when they bring you to trial and when they deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand about what you're to say, but say whatever is given to you in that hour, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. And brother will deliver brother over to death, and father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. So one of the things that is definitely to happen before the end is that the world will hate those who believe in Jesus.
And we haven't quite gotten there yet.
No, but we're getting there.
But we're heading that direction.
Okay.
For sure.
But the one who endures to the end will be saved. All right, we're going to stop right there. We will pick up on verse 14 next time.
Okay. My kid could get a ride home with one of you, right?
I think so.
Okay. I'm just kidding. I'm just gonna hear that as sure. She's got a ride home.
Yeah.
My selective hearing. Dude, I think my knee's infected.